All right, we are recording and we are very thrilled to have Michael DeCesare here. Michael is professor of sociology at Merrimack College. He is the chair of AAUP's Committee on College and University Governance and vice president of the Massachusetts AAUP conference and past president of Merrimack's AAUP chapter. So he has a really a ton of experience in shared governance, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike to present. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Matt, for the introduction and for the invitation to join you all today. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I put together a small PowerPoint presentation because, as I said to Matt, I thought it would be helpful for you all to have this as a resource. I know this is being recorded, but I'd also be happy to share this presentation with Matt or one of the other officers to disseminate to whoever you see fit. So please feel free to share it. Matt asked me to talk about strengthening the faculty's role in academic governance. And for me, kind of a preliminary step to that is to make sure that faculty have an understanding of what our proper role is in academic governance. And so that's where I'll focus the first part of my remarks, and then we'll move on to kind of concrete steps a chapter can take specifically and that a faculty more generally can take to strengthen their voice in governance of the institution. So, for an understanding of traditional academic governance principles and practices, of course, we turn to AAUP documents, and specifically the 1966 Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, which can be found in the Red Book. That statement is the cornerstone of academic governance in this country. It remains so today. It's included in countless faculty handbooks, either in part or verbatim. It forms the basis of many reputable institutions' governance structures. An interesting point about that statement, and an important one to make, especially in chatting with the president or with members of the governing board, is that statement was jointly formulated by the AAUP with the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, or the AGB, and the American Council on Education. Those groups represent governing board members and presidents respectively, and those groups commended that 1966 statement to their respective members. We were pleased a couple of years ago, 2017 or 2018, that the AGB affirmed in a statement by its board of directors that specific reference to the 1966 statement, quote, in the institution's governing documents is an important foundation, unquote, for the institution's commitment to shared governance. That reaffirmation of the 1966 statement by the AGB is another important point that can be made when talking with presidents and governing board members who sometimes believe that the statement is somehow outdated or irrelevant in today's context. So I just want to take us generally a couple of slides generally about what the statement's principles are. It calls for adequate communication, shared responsibility, and joint planning and effort among the institution's components, specifically the governing board, the administration, and the faculty. What's in bold-faced type on this slide forms the basis of the traditional conception of academic governance. The statement goes on to specify areas of primary responsibility for each of the three components, because, as the latter part of this slide says, the variety and complexity of the tasks that are performed by institutions of higher education produce an inescapable interdependence among the components. And I will go through these slides just as a warning rather quickly, just in the interest of time. But again, I'm happy to make this available to anybody who would like it. That appropriate joint planning and effort does not call for every component to have an equal voice in every decision that gets made on campus. Rather, participation depends on each component's degree of responsibility in that area. So differences in the weight of each component's voice should be determined by reference to the responsibility each component has for the particular matter at hand. More specifically, the statement, as I said, goes on to articulate the roles of the three components. I will not talk about the governing boards or administrations' primary areas of responsibility, just again, in the interest of time. But it is worth revisiting the faculty's responsibilities and areas of primary responsibility. Those include curriculum, subject matter and methods of instruction, research, faculty status, and those aspects of student life that relate to the educational process. Methods of instruction includes things like so-called modality and how we've been delivering our courses over the last 2.5 semesters. That should be a faculty decision, or should have been. Faculty status in particular, and matters related to it, are also a faculty responsibility. And that includes appointments, reappointments, decisions not to reappoint, promotions in rank, the granting of tenure, dismissal for cause. Those two are areas of primary faculty responsibility. It's a phrase I've used a few times already, primary responsibility. What does it mean? The statement makes quite clear what it means. It means that in those particular areas on the previous slide, the power of review or final decision that's lodged in the governing board or delegated by the board to the president should be exercised adversely only in exceptional circumstances and for reasons communicated to the faculty. And then after that, the faculty should have the opportunity for further consideration and further transmittal of its views to the president and board. And that's the joint effort and joint responsibility and adequate communication that the statement talks about in its opening paragraphs. The guiding principle here is that in these areas, the faculty's voice should be the dominant one. In areas of faculty primacy, again, boards and presidents should concur with faculty judgment, except in rare instances and for reasons which should be stated in detail. A provost doesn't get to simply overturn a tenure recommendation, a positive tenure recommendation. A president doesn't simply get to overturn a positive promotion recommendation. I often have administrators ask me when I give a similar talk why they shouldn't have the power to do those things. Why should the faculty, they ask me, be authoritative in these areas? And the answer is pretty simple, actually. The faculty is uniquely qualified to exercise decision-making authority in our areas of expertise. More specifically, as the statement says, scholars in a particular field have the competence, the chief competence for judging the work of their colleagues. If a sociologist applies for tenure, who better to judge that candidate's application than other sociologists? It's really quite simple. In addition, and more generally, the faculty's judgment is central to general educational policy, of course, as the people who do the teaching and carry out the research, which ostensibly are the purposes of the existence of higher education. The faculty's voice should be authoritative in areas related to teaching and research. In addition, the statement also prescribes that the faculty should have oversight over admissions, should set the requirements for degrees, and should determine when those degree requirements have been met. Not the registrar's office, not the admissions office, but the faculty. Even in areas where the faculty doesn't have primary responsibility, the faculty still participates in decision-making. Even though we don't have the primary voice, we should still be involved meaningfully in decisions about strategic planning, about facilities or physical plant. Budgetary matters, the faculty should be involved in. The faculty should have the same access to the same information that administrators have when it comes time to set the overall budget as well as the budget for different divisions of the institution. And then, of course, the faculty should participate meaningfully in the hiring and evaluation, and I would add retention as well, of administrators, especially academic administrators, deans, the provost, um, vice president for academic affairs, and the like, as well as, of course, the president. Back to adequate communication as one of the basic principles of sound academic governance, there should be structures in place, and they should be understood and observed for clear and adequate communication between the three components: the faculty, the administration, and the board. Specifically regarding faculty and the board, because this seems to happen less and less frequently, um, the AAUP has long recommended that every standing committee of the governing board, including its executive committee, should include a faculty representative. The AAUP has also long held that there should be direct communication between the faculty and the board, to occur through a conference committee or a liaison committee that consists only of faculty members and trustees, and that meets regularly to discuss topics of mutual interest. Arthur Lovejoy, one of the founders of the AAUP, famously described the relationship between the faculty and the governing board as taking the form of an hourglass, where we are at the top and bottom respectively, right? And in the middle, that thin middle, is the president's office. And the president's office filters what gets passed through from the board to the faculty, from the faculty to the board. And Lovejoy and the other founders always found that problematic. There should be direct communication without the president's presence between the board and the faculty. To boil it down, all voices are not equal in institutional governance. They are not. Again, the strength of one component's voice depends on whether that's an area of its primary responsibility and expertise. The faculty do not get to vote on every single decision that gets made on campus. The board of trustees, or the governing board, I should say, is the ultimate institutional authority. I know those last two things I said are not always popular things to say among faculty, but that is the case. And the governance statement of 1966 says as much. That said, the faculty should exercise primary responsibility in areas of its expert knowledge. The faculty is the body to whom the board delegates authority in those areas I listed on an earlier slide: subject matter and methods of instruction, curriculum, research, matters of faculty status, etc. And in those areas, again, it's worth repeating, the administration and the board should normally concur with faculty recommendations. In other words, in academic matters, a faculty decision should normally be a final one. In other words, the administration and board should maintain a hands-off policy with regard to those areas I listed earlier and that I reproduced on the bottom half of this slide. Those belong to us as faculty. That's my understanding of the traditional conception of academic governance. What follows here in terms of steps that the faculty and an AAUP chapter can take to strengthen it flows from those assertions that I made on the previous slides about where our primary responsibility lies. So one good first step is to analyze the governance structure on campus. What are its strengths and weaknesses of the current system? Every system has weaknesses. No governance structure is perfect. They're in constant need of attention and tinkering, and that's an ongoing project. Maybe a step, in analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the existing governance structure, it's always helpful to compare it with the standards that are set forth in the Statement on Government, as well as derivative association documents, some of which I linked to on the last slide. Compare it. I mean, how does it stack up compared to what, everything I've said so far and the other things that are in the governance statement that I haven't included in this presentation? It's always helpful to compare your own structure to those of institutions that are known for good practices. Unfortunately, those seem to be fewer and further between these days, but it's always helpful at the very least to talk to colleagues at other institutions about how they do things. Hey, do you evaluate your academic deans? And if so, what does it look like? Because we don't do that and we're thinking about doing it. Things like that. And then come up with a plan. I mean, the decision typically comes down to whether you need to overhaul the whole thing or attack it piecemeal. And just based on my own experience, the latter is the more fruitful approach typically, unless your governance structure is just a gigantic disaster, which I don't get the sense it is at Syracuse. It's best to focus on the areas that need immediate attention and kind of go after those as a first step. So hold public forums on governance with people on campus who have been involved in leadership positions in the chapter or in the Senate or the equivalent of the Senate, or what you have at Syracuse. Bring in outside speakers as well who can speak not only to their own institutions' practices and policies, but to those at others as well. Back to adequate communication, that third bullet point. Discuss governance with your president and other members of the academic administration. Talk about it with governing board members if you have regular access to them. And then, of course, there should be standing faculty committees for every area that cover every area that involves academic decisions. Again, the list I had on the previous slides. Some things to watch out for: mixed committees, especially mixed committees that focus on areas of faculty primacy. And by mixed committees, I mean those that are a combination of some faculty, some administrators, some staff, maybe some students. Generally speaking, those are not as effective or beneficial to the faculty as purely faculty committees are. On a related note, all the ad hoc committees, task forces, blue ribbon commissions, and the like that we've seen pop up, especially once the pandemic, at the onset of the pandemic last year, those should generally be avoided, especially when they're established unilaterally by a governing board or a president. At the time the virus hit, it was kind of inevitable that there would have to be some way for presidents and boards to pull together a campus community. And so the establishment of a task force at that point wasn't necessarily problematic to make quick decisions like to move all remote last March. But when those task forces stick around and the membership becomes a little fuzzy and it's still here after a year and it starts to circumvent faculty senate committees, then problems arise. Faculty appointments to all committees should be made by the faculty, ideally by faculty voting, rather than by presidential appointment or board appointment or what have you. And that last bullet point may seem odd, but the AAUP has also for a while now strongly recommended faculty be actively involved in the accreditation process, especially in terms of the drafting of the self-study report, and in particular the section on academic governance. Just about every regional accrediting agency has a standard devoted, at least in part, to the governance of the institution. It's important for faculty to be involved in drafting that section of the self-study. The use of confidentiality agreements as a condition for participating in shared governance, typically a bad idea as well. That goes hand in hand with the increasing prevalence of quote unquote closed searches for administrators, especially presidents. We saw it in the Wisconsin system a couple of years ago. We saw it in Iowa 5 or 6 years ago, and they typically end in disaster for the institution. So those should not be, faculty should object to both of those first two, what's mentioned in both of those first two bullet points. At a minimum, I mean, if you sign a confidentiality agreement, you can't really be you can't really call yourself a faculty representative. If you can't share information with the faculty, if you can't inform the faculty of anything that you do on the committee, if you can't seek input from them, you're not actually representing anybody except yourself. And so those expectations should be established too for how faculty representatives conduct themselves, whether it's on standing faculty committees or one of these presidentially appointed task forces. Make sure there's sound academic governance at all levels of the university. We tend to think at the highest level, but good governance, I've more and more I've started to believe really starts at the departmental level, the program level. If you don't have it in your department, you don't model it in your department, especially for your junior colleagues, it's not going to flow up through the college or school level, and definitely not to the university level. It does not flow down, is one thing I've learned. Good governance flows up, oddly, as odd as that sounds. The national staff in the AUP office are a great resource, and you all in New York are really fortunate because you have a really strong and active and vocal state conference. And the officers of your state conference are seasoned, they're experienced. I just spoke at the annual or the spring meeting of the New York conference a couple of weeks ago, and I was really impressed just by the turnout and the participation. So that's another great resources you all have where you in the state you happen to be in. Faculty generally should learn to work with the chapter leadership. Chapter leadership, if it hasn't already, is able to establish itself as an authority on AAUP policy and how that applies to the local environment. Encouraging colleagues to participate in governance, literally knocking on your department colleagues' door and saying, "You going to the Senate meeting today?" You probably should, because there's some important stuff on the agenda. Starting that conversation can sometimes be a really simple way to increase involvement and strengthen the faculty's voice. In terms of the chapter itself, there's all kinds of things you can do in terms of promoting the association's governance standards. And I don't know how much of this you all already do or don't do, so I apologize if some of these are moot. But publishing a newsletter, communicating with the president and the board, inviting them to chapter events so they learn what the AUP is about. Sponsoring, events, meetings, forums. A website is always a good thing to have, a Twitter account, an Instagram account. The more present, the more visible, I should say, the chapter can make itself, the more powerful it will become, both in the eyes of the faculty and in the eyes of the administration. Administer a governance climate survey. There's a document on the AAUP's website, which I linked to here. It's called Indicators of Sound Governance. It's essentially a questionnaire that asks about different aspects of your governance structure and how it functions. It can give you a good sense of where you need to focus and where the shortcomings might be. Advocating for the regular evaluation of administrators. Guidance for that is in a derivative AAUP policy document that I linked to at the end of this presentation. Supporting and cooperating with faculty governance bodies like a Senate and Senate committees, and encouraging chapter members to get involved on those kinds of committees. The more overlap between chapter membership and Senate membership, typically the better for the faculty. And that is this is the final slide, and it's just, these are links to documents that you might find helpful. Most of them are in the Red Book, which is another, I think, good thing to practice, carrying around the Red Book and showing it off. The chapter can make a gift of the Red Book to the president and to the chair of the board to give them a sense of where you all are coming from as AUP members when you think about governance. And so that, that first resource is the 1966 statement. And then there are a couple of derivative documents, 4 derivative documents that I've included. The AAUP up on its website has developed some great principles and standards really quickly late last spring for the coronavirus crisis. And then that last one is the AGB Board of Directors statement that I mentioned about halfway through the presentation, reaffirming the importance of including the 1966 statement in institutional policies. And I hope I didn't go over time, Matt.
Not too bad. Thank you so much, Mike. That was really great. And I think, I don't know about everyone else, but definitely like felt a lot of overlap with things happening here at Syracuse, a lot of insight of how that can apply to what's happening here. So what I'd like to do, at least for maybe 10 minutes, is just sort of have a kind of open Q&A for Mike, if people have sort of direct questions for what he just presented, and then we can move on to kind of more strategizing. So if, I see Harvey's got a question. I'll go straight to Harvey.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Michael. What a great presentation, so succinct and comprehensive.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of shoulds in that presentation. I wonder how many do's are out there, though. You know, we should have a faculty rep. We have one here. That faculty rep we should have faculty meeting with all of the committees within the governing body. We don't do that. And also, we have always respected the confidentiality of the Board of Trustees. So the faculty rep is very limited in what he or she can report back to the faculty. But my question really is about best practices. You know, you mentioned that, yeah, we should reach out to colleagues we might know at other schools, but does AAUP or anybody else, provide information about best practices around the country so that we could go there and find out that, hey, 30 schools, 100 schools in this country have faculty reps. They're directly elected. They meet, they report back. How do we, is there any easy way to get that information?
It's a great question, and one that is extremely timely. And I apologize for looking away. I'm trying to pull up on my other screen a link to, and I don't know if it's available yet, Jorg Tita in the AAUP's national office. He's the director of the research department, just completed a national survey. It's the first one that's been done in 20 years, a national survey of governance practices. And he asks, I mean, it's a lengthy questionnaire that asks about just about every aspect of the governance structure and governance practices on campus that you can think of. And so he hasn't started to release the results yet, I don't think. He has shared some with the governance committee. But yes, it's coming very soon. And it should be, the whole purpose of him doing that survey was to answer exactly the question you asked, Harvey, because it's one that he and I have gotten repeatedly and increasingly over the last few years. And we just haven't had recent data to share with people. Even the survey from 20 years ago wasn't of the, in my view, wasn't of the greatest quality. So your survey will put those best practices, as you put it, in one place for faculty to be able to reference, especially if it enables you to go to your president and say, look, 92% of presidential searches in this country, search committees, include faculty. Why do you not want to have any faculty on our search committee for the next president? It makes us an outlier. It puts us in a group of institutions that we don't want to be in. The norm is to have us involved. When you have that data to make that case, it goes a lot further, I think. So I would encourage you to reach out to Jorg directly. His email address is on the AAUP's website, or I can send it to you. It's just jt@aaup.org, and he can fill you in more about that survey. But the results, I want to say he's going to start publishing the results in the bulletin, the AAUP's bulletin that comes out over the summer. So you'll be able to find them there.
Great. We have Corin and then Crystal. And a reminder, we're still recording this portion. So if people have questions in the chat, they can put them there.
So I really appreciated your comment about the governance working from the department up. I'm a first year, ending up my first year as a department chair. And one of the challenges that I find for increasing good faculty governance structures, we were just having a meeting this morning about this, is the ways in which the dean's office controls course releases for directorship. So one of the things that I really want to do is offload some of the responsibilities of the chair, not responsibilities of the chair, but responsibilities that the chair has taken onto themselves and have accrued to the chair. And it doesn't seem to me that's the appropriate job of the chair. It should be the job of the director of undergraduate studies, but the course release is just pittance. Like there's no, and so it becomes this kind of trap for these structures. So I'm wondering whether there are strategies that the AAUP recommends or that for navigating that kind of thorny obstacle to more shared governance.
I just want to make sure I understand what you're asking. So you'd prefer that the responsibility for determining course releases rest with?
No. This is something like, so we have in our department, we have a very weak director of undergraduate studies because they only get one course release over their whole term.
Okay.
One course is released. So they can't do much because they're too busy. They don't get any course release time in order to do anything as an administrator. So the chair basically has to do, and the staff do a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. That should be the job of a director of undergraduate studies. But if the dean won't say, oh, you can have a course release, we can increase the level of course release for the director of undergraduate studies, then the hands are tied. And that we run into that in a number of areas. That's just one example.
Thank you. I understand. I think, and I don't have any AAUP recommendations, that speak to that level of specificity, but I can say as a former department chair who suffered through 9 consecutive years of the chairship and dealt with similar issues, I always found it helpful to take it up as a group with the dean, with the other chairs, in your case, with the other undergraduate program directors, and to talk it through as a group and say, look, they can't do the job because one isn't enough. They need more. It's fallen on us as chairs, and that's just not acceptable. And so at some point, it becomes a matter of faculty standing in solidarity with each other and saying these working conditions are just not sustainable. And whether you need to go to the dean with that first, which in this case I would, if the dean says no, take it to the next level. Say, okay, we understand your position. Now we're going to appeal to the provost since you don't seem to understand. And I hate to sound so confrontational. I don't hate it, but I prefer not to sound so confrontational, especially with a group of people I've never met before. But governance is confrontational. I mean, participating meaningfully in academic governance, there's going to be conflict. We have, the 3 components have very different, in many areas, we have very different agendas. We have different interests. We certainly have different areas of expertise. So there's going to be conflict. And once we accept that, it becomes a lot easier to engage in it and to get what we want. And so that would be my own personal recommendation based on my experience as a chair. I don't have anything I can point you to in terms of AAUP guidance, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Okay, Crystal.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely helpful presentation.
Well, thank you.
I have a million questions, but I'm going to try to focus on the most urgent. I think that one of the things that has confronted us as a chapter, I'm the past president, is that there always seem to be fires everywhere, right? I mean, literally everywhere. And so the strategizing that you properly said should be one of our goals is very difficult because new things crop up continuously. So I will give two concrete examples of what I'm talking about. Several years ago, we lost control over promotion, which used to be completely a faculty function. And it was taken away from us by fiat, by the Board of Trustees. The Senate passed a resolution objecting to this strenuously, which they completely ignored. And we would, of course, like to have that control back, but how to fight it in the context of all of these millions of other things, like, for example, the continuous institution of task forces, which we have been fighting for as long as I can recall. And that one is really hard because the faculty who get put on it, of course, have an investment in that task force once they're on it, right? It's great for them, you know, feather cap, also all that. And so there's a divide and conquer thing that happens with so many things, right? That there are many, many fires, one divide and conquer problem. And the other divide and conquer problem is that the administration has learned all of these techniques for turning the faculty against each other, even if that's not exactly the way that people would put it, that is the effect, right? And so I would really value some advice about how to proceed in these divide and conquer things, which, you know, the whack-a-mole problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's the question that gets to the heart of it, right? I mean, I recently was making the argument to another group that I talked with that in participating in academic governance feels way too frequently like we're playing defense all the time. And it would be nice if we could play offense sometimes, most of the time. And I mean, the only way to get to that position, though, I mean, especially when there are so many fires to put out all over the place, and I totally understand what you're saying with that, is to, I mean, I guess the best advice I have would be to pick the battles, because you can't take them all on. You just can't. Faculty, you know, we teach and do research too in our spare time. And on top of that, we have to fight fires all the time, those of us who are conscientious about governance. So you have to pick the battles. Another technique that has become one of the things I've been heartened by since the onset of the pandemic, even though governance is facing an acute crisis in this country, I've been heartened by how frequently students and alumni have partnered with faculty to object to decisions that are simply being made by governing boards and administrations. Decisions about, you know, dismissing tenured faculty to closing down the child care center on campus. That happened in Massachusetts recently. And it's faculty aren't alone is something for us, I think, to remember. Students especially, but also alumni, can be important allies. These are people who care about the future of the institution. And so if they perceive that their professors are being treated unfairly, or that some, you know, faceless board member, faceless to a student, is trampling on areas where the faculty should be making decisions, they can be important allies for us. So I guess, and I would also, as a third thing, there's a third piece of advice maybe, is as I've gotten older, I've become less reluctant. I've become more willing to publicly call out bad behavior when it comes to violations of academic governance. Go to the student newspaper, write an op-ed for the local paper, put up a blog post on the Academe blog and say, this is what's going on. Administrations and boards fear very few things, but one of them is bad public relations. Another one is anything that might threaten retention or recruitment of students. So these are things that faculty can, for lack of a better term, exploit, especially in under conditions where a board and an administration are acting unilaterally across areas as you described it. I don't know if that's helpful, but it's the most nuts and bolts
Yeah,
that I have.
that's great, Mike. Thanks. So we only have about 12 minutes left, and I'd like to now, if we can, transition more to the kind of strategize. It's woefully inadequate amount of time to really strategize about what to do at Syracuse, but I'd like to kind of see if we can put our heads together on that question now. And what I'm going to do is turn off the recording. And